All right, let's get back to the big boys here and the ACC, and we'll start with the Coastal Division, and obviously we're talking about Miami, Virginia Tech, North Carolina, Georgia Tech, Duke, and Virginia. Miami's got this quarterback Harris. He's got a year under his belt now. They're coming to Ohio State in the second game of the season. Virginia Tech, of course. Beamer is always tough, and we talked about them earlier. You're saying that our old buddy Butch Davis is going to have a pretty formidable team at North Carolina. Say it ain't so, Phil.
Unfortunately, I tell you, I talk to NFL scouts during when I'm writing a magazine, and I say, okay, who's the top defensive line prospects? And it seemed like every other player they threw out, North Carolina was after the name. Same thing at linebacker, same thing at defensive back. They may have 5 to 6 picks in the first and second round of the draft. You talk about a nasty defense. That's North Carolina this year. Now, offensively, they only averaged 303 yards per game last season. TJ Yates had a negative ratio. He's much maligned. He's been the starter there for 3 years, but fans aren't really that thrilled with him. But I think no matter who wins the starting job at North Carolina, whether it's TJ Yates or whether it's Bryn Renner, they'll put up improved stats this year. In fact, the offense has 9 starters back. They're much stronger on that side of the ball. And the great thing about being a North Carolina offense, you don't have to go out there and win a football game. Just don't turn the ball over. That's what's going to hurt you, because that defense is nasty in all 3 levels. And I think when you look at North Carolina, perhaps the best defense in the country. And when you look at their schedule, there's 2 games.
Yeah, let's look at their schedule. They got LSU.
Well, I think they beat LSU in the opener. You know, North Carolina's got 19 returning starters. They've got that defense. LSU was outgained by their opponents last year, and they only have 9 returning starters. I think North Carolina gets that one. The only 2 games I have an underdog all year are at Miami of Florida and at Florida State, and I have them a small underdog in those games. They can easily win those. This is a North Carolina team that might just contend there late in the season. We'll see how they do on those 2 road games, especially at Miami. I think that's the key game in the ACC this year, North Carolina at Miami.
You got Georgia Tech a little down this year, don't you?
Well, actually, I think Georgia Tech's good. No matter who you pick in that conference, in that division, I should say, you got all 4 teams. Any of those 4 teams could be top 10 at the end of the year, depending how their games go. And the thing with Georgia Tech, when you prepare for them, you have to prepare for that spread option offense, as you know, that Paul Johnson runs. But now defensively, they bring in Al Groh. Al Groh has a 3-4 defense. Not a lot of colleges run 3-4. So if you're an offensive coordinator, that's a headache week for you. So both coordinators that are taking on Georgia Tech, going through some headache weeks. But Georgia Tech does draw the toughest schedule of the trio. They have to play on the road Virginia Tech. They have to play Georgia and North Carolina on the road, plus Clemson. All 4 of those games on the road this year. A team like Miami of Florida, the team I picked to win that division, only plays one of the big boys on the road. So schedule had a lot to do with it, but I'll tell this about Paul Johnson. Last year I picked him 3rd and they won the ACC. It wouldn't surprise me if he did it again. But as I mentioned, all 4 of those teams are not only potential ACC coastal winners, but also national title winners. And Virginia Tech, I talked about them earlier, to Rod Taylor, the outstanding backfield that they have. Bud Foster defense, while they don't have a lot of returning starters, they're still going to be solid. Frank Beamer on special teams. I think they knock off Boise. I think they open up the season 9-0, but then 2 big games at the end. They have to play at Miami of Florida, at North Carolina, back-to-back weeks. That'll determine whether they can win the Coastal and be a national title contender. But the team I went with, and should be a little disconcerting for Ohio State fans, is Miami of Florida. You know, last year, Ja'Cory Harris, they opened up out of the box. And when I did my national radio shows, everybody talked about the 4 games they had to open with. 4 ranked teams out of the box. They won 3 of them. And Ja'Cory Harris had great success over those 4 games. But
the Virginia Tech game was really what started their downfall.
Well, they didn't have a bad season, but what happened was Ja'Cory Harris started feeling a little too confident. He had too much success. Then he said, you know what, I can throw the ball anywhere I want. So he ended up with a 24-17 ratio, and that's probably what cost him. But the Virginia Tech game was a big one. It was played in the rain. Virginia Tech was the underdog. They were fired up at home. But this year, Miami of Florida gets most of the tough teams at home. In fact, the only game on the road besides Ohio State that I have an underdog is at Georgia Tech.
What about at Pitt?
The game at Pitt, I think, is winnable. I think when you look at the talent that Miami of Florida stacks up, they have a lot more returning talent than does Pitt. Pitt's a team that lost a lot of starters, a lot of lettermen. While they have a good defensive line, I think Miami of Florida out-athletes them. Plus, if you look at the quarterback situation, you've got a brand-new quarterback for Pitt. You got Ja'Cory Harris for Miami of Florida. I think Miami of Florida's better athletic talent, capable of winning that one on the road.
There's where we go back to the Big East again. The champion may have 3 or 4 losses.
Absolutely, and I think that's going to happen with Pitt this year because as I told you, those 3 non-conference games all concern me. All 3 of them would be the possibility. So I think 3 or 4 losses
How
is
good
a
is the
possibility.
Miami defense to go up against Pryor and Ohio State?
My number 4 rated defensive line, number 12 set of linebackers, and number 11 DBs. They have size, they have speed, they're nasty. The only weakness that I see with Miami of Florida, unfortunately might have got solved by the Central Henderson thing, is the offensive line. They only had 2 starters back on the offensive line. Now they'll get Henderson in, but keep in mind, he's a true freshman. It's their 2nd game of the season, and he's got to go up against somebody like Cam Hayward, who's a grizzled veteran. I think he'll struggle in that particular game. So I still think the advantage lies at the line of scrimmage for Ohio State. Our defensive line against their offensive line should be a tight game, but I still think the Buckeyes come away with a 7 to 10 point win.
Okay, let's go to the Atlantic Division portion of the ACC, which is Florida State, Boston College, Clemson, Maryland, Wake Forest, and NC State.
Well, to me, last year Florida State was everybody's preseason favorite to win the Atlantic, and
Bowden's gone now.
Yeah, and they played decent. Their defense was the problem last season, and last year they actually were in the bottom 10 of my rankings as far as total amount of tackles returning. The percentage of tackles returning was only 38%, and who would ever thought a Mickey Andrews defense would allow over 400 yards per game? I never thought I'd see it, but that happened last year. I think Jimbo Fisher steps into a great situation, and while Florida State was a consensus pick to win the Atlantic last year I went out on a limb and had Clemson there. I like C.J. Spiller, I like Jacoby Ford, I like their quarterback who was a redshirt freshman, and Clemson didn't disappoint me. They played in the ACC title game against Georgia Tech. But this year, Clemson probably loses their quarterback, Harper, who got drafted in the draft. They lose Spiller, they lose Ford. I like the replacements. They're good, but they have a tougher schedule this season. Boston College is a good team. I don't think they're up there with Florida State. I think when you look at Florida State, Jimbo Fisher inherits a very talented offense. Christian Ponder is a legitimate Heisman candidate. They have one of the top offensive lines in the country. The defense has too much athleticism to be that bad, so to be stronger, and they have a top defense, and they've got the schedule to get there as well. I look for Florida State to finally get back to the ACC title game, and it's not Bowden. If Bobby Bowden was the head coach, I'd make the same exact call. I just think Jimbo Fisher steps into a great spot.
But boy, the couple of tough. They're at Oklahoma in their 2nd game of the season, and then their traditional rival Florida to conclude the season, with Miami right smack in the middle of the schedule, and BYU. Now, is this a down year for BYU?
I think it is. BYU
They
lost.
get BYU at home.
Yes, and BYU, lost their running back this year. He became ineligible. He went to the NFL supplemental draft. Last year, Florida State went out to BYU and really showed the speed advantage there. They just tore them apart. BYU couldn't stop their offense, and this year they get them at home. I think they'll be able to beat BYU. But I do have an underdog at Oklahoma, at Miami of Florida, and home against Florida.
So you can see Florida State feasibly with 2 or 3 losses and still winning the ACC championship.
Well, they'll have
Miami?
1 loss in the ACC. That's the key. It's all division records.
Right.
So the only team I have them losing to in the ACC is at Miami of Florida. Yeah, I've got them at 7-1. I've got Boston College and Clemson each at 5-3. So I think that Florida State will be in the ACC title game. That one's easy for me to call. It's the other side of the coin. I don't want to go against Georgia Tech. I don't want to go against Virginia Tech.
Right.
I don't want to go against North Carolina.
The 4 teams.
I just went with Miami of Florida.
So does that mean Florida State is your choice to win it?
No, Miami of Florida is. I think whatever team comes out of the Coastal is the best team in the ACC. Those 4 teams are probably the best 4 teams, and unfortunately they all play in the same division,
right.
Unfortunately for them. So I think whatever team emerges, and I'm picking Miami, comes over and beats Florida State. And the key is defense. Florida State will have an improved defense this year, but even if you improve by 75 yards per game, you're going from allowing 435 yards per game to 360. That's a middle-of-the-road defense. So I think the Coastal Division will have the better defense and win the ACC.
All right, let's go to the Big 12, where, of course, you have